Bass. Hello and welcome to another edition of Truth and Rhythm, brought to you by funkandstuff.net. This is the interview show that gets deep in the pocket with contemporary music's foremost masters of the groove. I'm your host, Scott Dr. GX Goldfine, and whether you're watching to the video version on funkandstuff.net or on YouTube or listening to the audio podcast version on iTunes, Spotify, or from other leading providers, I thank you, as always, for your continued interest and support in the show, which is also brought to you by Everything's on the One, the first guide of funk. Be sure you get your copy at Amazon if you don't have one already. Also available at funkandstuff.net, as well as the funkandstuff.net store, which has all kinds of great gear, funk and stuff, gear, truth and rhythm stuff, and funky things to play with. I also want to give a shout out to the Funk Hall of Fame and Exhibition Center in Dayton, Ohio, of which I'm proud to be an official funk ambassador. Go to the funkcenter.org to learn more and keep the funk alive. For today's episode, I'm delighted to welcome to the Truth and Rhythm Mothership LeRoi Johnson, who's the only surviving full brother of the late king of punk funk himself, Rick James. Johnson had a front row seat not only for Slick Rick's childhood and musical development, but also for his ascension to funk, soul, and pop crossover superstardom. And as James scored his biggest triumph with 1981's platinum-selling Street Songs album, Johnson joined in to manage his brother's business affairs throughout the decade. That comprised acting as tour manager and overseeing Mary Jane Productions, and its stable of acts including the Mary Jane Girls, Process and the Do-Rags, the Stone City Band, and Val Young. While James overshadowed his brother in terms of fame, both were blessed with special talents. Johnson holds a law degree as an accomplished classical guitarist and visual artist. In 2019, Johnson received hometown honors by being inducted into the Buffalo Music Hall of Fame. LeRoi, thank you so much for joining the show. How are you?
Good, I'm good. Thank you for the kind introduction. That was, you did your homework. That was pretty on point, pretty much. But I was also Rick's manager, not just the road manager.
Excellent. Okay. Well, we'll get into some of that nitty gritty. Really looking forward to it,
Okay.
and very much looking forward to hearing your great stories.
Okay. Let's do it.
Yeah, let's
as
do
they
it.
say.
And you're coming to us from Buffalo today, is that right?
Yes, I'm in Buffalo, New York, in my office.
Is the winter being kind to you?
This has been it hasn't been much of a winter here in Buffalo. We haven't had much snow. I don't think we've had 10 inches yet. And today it was 50, and I think the day before yesterday it was 60. Tomorrow will be 40, and then the next day it'll be Buffalo again, which will probably be high of 20, 25, something like that.
Wow,
Hopefully no snow.
People must be running around without shirts and shorts and stuff and going crazy with such a warm winter.
Only the fools.
So let's go back, way back. Test those memory banks, for starters. Growing up in obviously musical and artistic household, how and why were you and Rick drawn to your particular interests and develop those strengths?
Well, Rick was the music man. I tagged along. We did the cadets, and we did the African culture route, where we learned a lot about congas, percussion, and all that sort of thing. And Rick was more in the forefront on both of those levels. He was a lead drummer, played the snare drums with the cadets, and he also played the congas and the bongos with the African Culture Center. So, I mean, that was a foundation mostly for Rick, because basically I was playing the bass drum, and I wasn't as good with the conga or bongos with the African Culture Center. But Rick was naturally talented, so, you know, he did it. I did it as a follow along, the older brother.
And you guys were only, what, a year apart about, right?
11 months.
Who was older?
Rick is older. Come on.
So, all right, being the baby brother.
Yes. I said I followed along. That was the key. So that's the younger brother follows along.
So at what point did it become sort of apparent that Rick was probably going to be pursuing a life in music and you were going in your direction?
Well, you really didn't know that he was, his whole world was music. But I don't think we were thinking that that was going to be our entire world. I just know the Rick's focus was always singing, taking part in musical events, and say, for instance, if a talent show would come up, he'd jump into that. He was always writing songs or humming things, that sort of thing. I mean, you know, as a brother, you're looking at him. Okay, I mean, that's musical, maybe, you know, because Rick early on, Rick, instead of singing a lot of lead parts, he used to sing a lot of background parts, and it was kind of strange that he was singing more background than he was lead, but he was the only singer, you know. So that was a little bit strange to me. So when Rick went forward, like I remember him writing Melinda for Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers. And I thought that a lot of it was kind of background vocals that he had written, and basically it turned into lead vocals. But Rick learned a lot from doing that, and also I think he early on, the strongest part of his musical career was probably with the African Culture Center with Malcolm and I, and learning African chants and learning how to play different percussive instruments, bells, chimes, sticks, all different kinds of things. So, you know, I think that probably early on was his strongest influence.
How old would you say that was around?
I would say it was from 10 to 14, 15, just about the time he left home. I'm 10 years old.
And what was he like as otherwise? Was he funny? Was he mischievous? Was he, you know, very straight ahead?
Totally mischievous, as we would say up north. He was involved in a lot of things that kids his age just weren't involved in. He liked to do things, steal a car here and there, maybe break into someplace, that kind of thing, or like to play with the girls. I mean, at a very, very young age. He was just way ahead of himself. He would just do things that most kids just wouldn't do. And I would follow along and get in trouble for it. I mean, but Rick was very mischievous. So he was very independent and very creative about what he did. You know, he was ahead of everybody our age in all the things that he did. He liked to play sports. He was a really good athlete, played good football, good basketball. We used to play a lot of hockey, played good hockey. Rick James, the ice skater. But I mean, anything he wanted to do, he could do. So he would do it, and he'd be pretty good at it.
Who were some of his big early musical influences that inspired him, do you think?
Well, given that in our early days we had like 2 or 3 channels. We didn't have we had a sunrise to sunset R&B station, and we listened to a lot of rock. So I mean, on television, I know we used to watch a lot of Ricky Nelson. We watched a lot of Elvis. We watched a lot of the Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, and the Flamingos. But we also had the influence of jazz at home. But for the most part, when we were listening to what was on the radio, and basically we were listening to rock and roll.
Mm-hmm. And
only a little later when we moved out to this different district, which was Cold Spring, did we start listening to more R&B. And that R&B, the reason was because I think the station started staying on a little later. I think when we were growing up, it was sunrise to sunset, and sunset in Buffalo at 4:30. So we didn't get a whole lot of R&B, but we got quality R&B.
Are there any artists in particular that you could point to that sort of helped shape his early direction, you think?
Well, of course, the whole Motown thing. Motown was early, but they still had the acts that you listen to, Smokey Robinson and the Marvelettes and all those older groups that they had. Junior Walker and the All-Stars. I mean, we listened to a lot of it, but also we listened to a lot of jazz. We listened to a lot of Coltrane and Miles Davis and Billy Eckstine, Dakota Staton, Ella Fitzgerald. So, I mean, we got a taste of a lot of different types of music.
And when did it seem like he started, expanding his musical reach, in terms of maybe playing some bass or trying some other instruments and that kind of thing?
I think it all started at the tail end of our experience with the African Culture Center, because Malcolm kind of featured Rick a lot and took him to Chicago to do these chants and that sort of thing. And after he came back, he seemed to be more focused on music. And then he wrote, as I said earlier, he wrote the song Melinda, which is actually Dorinda at first, and he pitched Motown with it, and Motown took it and put it on Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers. So I think he at that point knew that he was a step ahead of a lot of other people, because when your dream is to go to Motown, when you go to Motown, the first thing that you've done, they accept, then it gives you a lot of confidence in your musical abilities. Even though I don't think that particular time that Rick was groomed yet.
Diamond in the rough, right?
As he was young, he always played pots and pans and glasses and lined them up on the table and played them with spoons and that. And my mother would always say, put those things away, and he's banging on. She said, why is he banging on all of these pots and pans? That kind of thing. So that's kind of the early part. And then you move into that period where we went from there to the cadets. And Rick got very good at playing the snare and tenor drums in the cadets, and he was kind of one of the lead drummers. Went on from there to the African Culture Center, where played percussive instruments and even learned a little bit about the harmonica, but played the bongos and the congos and the various chimes and that they had there. And he also learned how to chant there because they did a lot of chanting and a lot of singing. But something I missed out on was totally forgot about, which was we were both choir boys in the Catholic Church. So we learned a lot about singing parts then. So you can add that with the rest of it. And then when he went off to I'll just take a step back and go to when he went into this audition and kind of forced our way into an audition that had already started, already had people, and Rick convinced him that he had already applied, and so they let him sing. And he actually finished second to one of the major groups in Buffalo, which was surprising because as I said earlier, it sounded like he was singing more background than he was lead. And he actually sang by himself, but he finished second. And that was really inspirational. So after that, he started writing a little bit and maybe singing with a couple groups, but mostly corner singing, that sort of thing, which was big in 50s, early 60s.
The doo-wop thing, yeah.
That doo-wop thing, yeah. So then from there, he went off to Detroit to get his song, see if he can get a song accepted, which he did. He got it accepted with Motown. And from there, after that, he joined the service. And then he ran off to Canada, I think. And then that was a heavy musical experience for him there because he learned a lot about other instruments, guitar, bass, keyboards, and Rick could pick up things so fast that it was amazing that he could pick up any instrument and learn how to play it in no time, So he picked up a little bit of this, that, and the other. So before you know it, he had all the pieces there. From there he had a number of groups. And they recorded, all of them recorded different albums, and Salt and Pepper, The Great White Cane, Minor Birds, there might have been a few others up in Canada. While he was in Canada, then he ran back and forth to Los Angeles, all while he was AWOL, no doubt.
Were you in close contact with him through the service when he went to Canada?
Oh yeah. I'd go up to Canada a lot. And see them. And matter of fact, I was in Canisius at the time, and a lot of guys from Canisius always remind me, and I forgot about it, that a lot of them, mostly the basketball players, we used to race up to Toronto, see if we can get up there. We weren't just going up to see Rick, but we always ended up seeing Rick, and I would tell him Rick is going to be a star, and they look at me all funny after here's the guy, we're all black, and Rick is in an all-white group and wearing clothes that they thought was all funny, although we were wearing platform shoes and that kind of crazy stuff back then, and bell-bottoms. But a lot of the guys, they still remind me of that. Oh, man, I remember we went up to Toronto, you said your brother was going to be such and such. I thought it was crazy, And I don't even remember which ones, except for a couple of them that was there, but it seemed to be a whole lot of guys. We went up there a lot, so... I was with Rick when he went to Toronto. I would go up to see him on the weekends. He would sneak down. I was with Rick when he went out to Los Angeles, and he did some work with the Troubadour and some of those Santa Monica and Sunset Boulevard clubs. So, all along through the whole process, basically, I was there.
Well, and of course, the Minor Birds famously had Neil Young as a member.
Yes, Neil, Bruce Palmer, Stan Endersby, and a number of them. I used to go up and see them. They stayed in a section where it was a lot of hippies, a lot of draft dodgers, but now it's probably the finest area in Toronto. It's called Yorkville, and I remember Rick lived on Hazelton, and where he lived now is Hazelton Lanes, one of the finest, most expensive buildings in Toronto.
Wow. So I guess being there expanded not only musically with instruments, but his palette in terms of styles of music, right? I mean,
Yes, his styles and performance, because I remember going to one of the clubs to see him perform. Went to a number of them, but I was surprised that the way he performed and how he had learned to handle the mic, and the kind of things that he was doing on stage. You know, he was in a rock and roll setting, so he learned a lot from the rockers.
mm-hmm. So, and this is like early 70s, right?
This was late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
Late 60s, early 70s.
So, how many bids did he make for getting his own record deal before things lined up for him to get signed by Motown?
Well, Rick had a number of albums with a number of companies. Each one of them that I mentioned, the Great White Cane and Salt and Pepper, even he and Neil signed with Motown. So he had he was getting the deals, but the question was whether he was happy with the deals and whether or satisfied and whether he stayed, because Rick had other agendas right then. So he was still an energetic young guy who wasn't as responsible as he should have been. And I think Rick didn't even make it until he was like 31, 32. And that's when he hit at Motown. Actually, let me see. He was 30. He hit when he was 30. He was like 1978 was his first hit with I guess it was You and I and that. But Rick was 30 years old. So he had calmed down a little bit. He was a little bit. He wasn't as loose as he was, I should say, because, when he had those other deals, he'd walk out for any reason. He'd just walk out on the deal and go on to the next thing. So he settled down with Motown, and because really before he went to Motown, he started his own label and had produced a record. I mean, Come Get It. Not Come Get It, I'm sorry. What was the name of that song?
Oh yeah, I know when you're talking. I had heard that.
Get up and dance.
Yeah, that's a good track too. Yeah.
Yeah, he did Get Up and Dance, and he marketed himself. So he learned a lot about marketing, promotion, and that from having his own record label. So he did that, and after he did that, that's when he went to Motown. That's when he started putting together an album to take to Motown.
Yeah, when he put out that track, I mean, he already had formulated pretty much what that Rick James Stone City Band sound was going to be, I think, on that.
Actually, he started before that. He had that sound before that. I think the test marketing came with Get Up and Dance. How could he work this? How does the whole system really work? So he did that. He did a few concerts, not of his own, but concerts with the Ohio Players and other groups, see how the box office thing worked. So really, by the time Rick got to Motown, he understood the business pretty well. He understood what he could do with contracts and the rest. But nevertheless, he still signed a bad contract with Motown. But I mean, I knew entertainment law, so most of my clients, I say, look, if you get any contract, you're doing better than you did before. And if you hit, then we can renegotiate. So a bad contract, any contract is a good contract.
Well, I know you didn't manage him until a few years later, but did he confer with you on anything like that at that time?
Not early on. Not early on. He had a Motown lawyer that he used, and as I said, he would have done the same thing I did. You have no real value when you first come on as an artist. The company, no matter how good they think you are, they're taking a risk. So you're not going to get the best of contracts. But once you hit, then you renegotiate and times change. But sometimes the record company doesn't. And when I came along, that's when we renegotiated the contract.
It sounds like he spent his, late teens and 20s sort of like sowing his oats and experimenting musically. And then when he finally got his deal with Motown, he had really figured it all out.
Right. Well, what he took to Motown was really a great album from start to finish. I think he understood when he got there that he needed something, and this was an expression of himself. And it was different because it had the elements of rock, some elements of the African Culture Center, if you listen. I mean, I can hear things from a lot of the different albums because I heard all of them, and you can take a song like Melinda and listen to that and think in terms of putting Rick's voice in there. And it's all Rick James, no question, in my view. So he took that kind of knowledge, and that's what he took and made it into something that was his style, and something that reflected him as the outrageous person that he was.
Mm-hmm.
Did
him getting that Motown deal, did it harken back at all to when he had that song sold to them, or was it completely independent of that?
Well, Rick was always wanted to be part of Motown because Motown, you have to think in terms of the era. Motown was the Harvard of the music business. Stevie, Smokey, Marvin, the Temptations, the Supremes, the Marvelettes, anybody. Rick wanted to be a part of that legacy. And he had already been a part of it once before as a writer, but now he wanted to be part of it as an artist. Yes, he wanted to go there. I don't know if any other company could have really done what Motown did for him, because it was the perfect place for him. Although Motown's style was a little different, they were ready for somebody like Rick to take them into the 1980s, away from disco. Yes.
So how did Rick react, and how did you react in friends and family when you and I hit it like it did?
Well, I was always waiting around for the song. I was living in D.C. at the time, and I was doing my own thing in the music business with people in the music business in D.C. So I would always tell them that I had a brother who was going to be a star in that, and they would same thing. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, cool. Let's see. And then when it hit, when I really knew that it was Rick, because on the radio sometimes you don't catch the name, but I heard you and I, and that I was like, yeah, finally he's calling, man. I got a song. The song is hitting. Came down to D.C. and I took him around to the radio stations and introduced him to a few people, Chuck Brown and Gil Scott-Heron's people. This is my brother, the one I've been telling you about. It's like, okay, and he was dressed with fringe, leather fringe clothes, and some wild hat and braids, and this is before he really turned and started really with the serious braids and all the other stuff. This was in between the time of him going out on the road and the record hitting. So he would come to D.C. and we would hang out, and I would take him around to my friends, and then they thought, here I am at Georgetown, and Rick, who's this wild dude, your wild brother? It's like they couldn't understand how the two of us were so different. But that's the way it was.
Yin and yang kind of thing.
Yeah. Of course.
I remember when I first heard that track, right away it clicked, and I was DJing at the time, and it became a quick favorite because, the long version was on the album, you know, like 8 or 9 minutes on the album itself, which was pretty cool.
Hmm.
Um, and then Mary Jane, of course, followed and was another big hit off that record. He was off and
Right,
running.
right, right. Well, usually you don't have somebody who hits that big on their first album, followed by another big album, followed by I think two big albums in a row. Um,
How,
but
how, how much control did he have? And did he have full creative control over, the cuts that would be on the record, over his image?
well, he had control over his image. Motown in the first albums or so had well, Rick gave him what he had, and they loved that. So they didn't have any creative control, other than the fact that Contract did have creative control in it with Motown because of the verbiage that was in there, which ultimately I changed to instead of being commercially satisfactory, which gave them the rights to decide, to technically satisfactory. You can't question an artist who's successful. You have no one there who can really question a successful artist whose music is really different than any other artist you have there. You don't have anybody who can analyze this and say this is a hit or this isn't a hit. This is not Smokey, and this is not Stevie, and this is not Michael. This is Rick, and his music is totally different. So you cannot question and tell me what's going to hit or what's not going to hit. You have Rick, and Rick is the one who makes that decision. That started in about '82.
It seemed like Rick was sort of Motown's answer to like Parliament Funkadelic, and that, what Warner's and Casablanca and whatever was getting with that. Motown was able to sort of get this very flamboyant, hard funk
Believe me,
act.
Motown wasn't thinking nothing about George Clinton. George Clinton was George. George had the funk down, and he had his whole sound and his whole people, his whole followers. Motown had a sound that Rick was, and it was funk, but it was something that was different. I mean, Rick's sound is different than the Parliament Funkadelics,
Yeah.
and the followers. Some of them are just cold-blooded P-Funkers, and the others are Rick. So very seldom I don't think those two come together much. I don't think Motown was thinking about that at all. They're thinking about this music is hitting. We know how to take it to the next level. Let's take it to the next level. Now, it was Rick who came in there, and Rick would say, look, I want you to put more effort into my music in other markets, and maybe that market, like DC or something like that, is that a market that the P-Funk had, or the Gap Band, or one of those groups. And during those years, the early years, we weren't worried about Prince.
Yeah.
And Michael had gone sour, and then only to resurrect himself in 83, 84, something like that. But in those interim years, before he left Motown, he wasn't really doing a whole lot until he got to CBS. I mean, he did stuff early, and then there was a little gap there, and then that's when Rick came in.
So things happened really quickly for Rick after that. I mean, it was like a record a year, or so. In one case, I think 2 came out in one calendar year. But Fired Up came out, that album, and Busting Out of L7, which is one of my favorite songs that he did. I think maybe could be his funkiest song of them all. Really hard-hitting album. And then he kind of mellowed out with Garden of Love for a record. But also during that time, he was branching out already to like Tina Marie and things like that. Was it always his vision to sort of build his own little empire of acts?
I think it was after he started rolling. He wanted to have a number of acts under our production company. Tina was something different. I think when Rick met Tina, Tina was somebody with a lot of talent who Motown wasn't able to do a whole lot with. They didn't have the right producers, and Tina wasn't the easiest to get along with either. But Tina knew what she had. Tina knew that she could sing and she could do. She wanted some control over her musical direction also. And once she got with Rick, then I think she found more of herself, and then she got the freedom that she wanted. I always said that Tina was the only white person who couldn't cross back over to being white. and very few black people thought that Tina was white, and she was totally accepted in the black community and unheard of in the white, but just a tremendous person, tremendous singer.
One of my all-time favorites, like her and Shaka Khan, are two of my favorites. But
yeah.
I mean, he did great work with her on that first record with "Sucker for Your Love," and I think there was a duet ballad on there too. I think, but great results. I mean, he really helped get her launched.
Yeah, well, she deserved it. I mean, however, I mean, she was sitting. I remember she lived with Berry Gordy's brother, Fuller Gordy, and she was a secretary up at Motown. And I believe Rick heard her sing and asked, "What are you guys doing with her?" And they hadn't really gotten it together. That she had a few bands. She was in a few bands. I think with one of Berry's sons, and even Benny Medina was in that band, I think. So when he finally worked with her, then, as I said, she took off.
Hit me, y'all! Y'all better take some insurance out on your booty tonight. Because we are not responsible. Ain't it fucking that?